Here we go. The subcommittee will come to order. The chair now recognizes himself for an opening statement. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today for this really important hearing on protecting American manufacturing, examining EPA's proposed PM2.5 rule. For the health of our constituents, the environment, and the economy, it is vital that the EPA set balanced standards for air quality. The EPA has a long history of regulating fine particulate matter, referred to as PM2.5, under the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS. The Clean Air Act directs the EPA to review these standards every 5 years, and the last review of PM2.5 standards was completed in 2020. However, the Biden EPA decided to reconsider the PM2.5 standards just 6 months after the previous review was finalized, a discretionary decision that will have significant negative impacts across the entire country. In January of this year, EPA announced a proposal to lower PM2.5 primary standards from the current 12 micrograms per cubic meter to somewhere in the range of 9 to 10 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, this doesn't sound like very much, but as I'll explain in a minute, this can have drastic negative effects that would stifle manufacturing in our country and run counter to an administration that claims to have an industrial policy. Even worse, the EPA is considering dropping the standard to as low as 8 micrograms per cubic meter, a level that is approaching natural background levels in many areas of the nation. To my colleagues on both sides, this is not what the Clean Air Act was designed to do. Lowering the standard to 8 or 9 micrograms per cubic meter would put hundreds of counties in economically active areas around the nation into non-attainment. And a standard of 10 is not much better. Ultimately, the EPA's proposal locks these areas into a host of compliance obligations and oversight that extends years, even if they come back into compliance. What's more troubling, and a central reason why this administration should reuse its discretion and go back to the drawing board, is that vast regions of the nation will be so close to non-attainment that they will be unable to permit new and expanded manufacturing and other industrial activities. The map behind me from the EPA docket and testimony this morning shows the problem. Virtually every economically active area of the nation would be negatively impacted by these proposed standards. You can take a look. Here's where they want to go to, and that's the current on the left-hand side. So, friends, we've heard from Republicans and Democrats about the importance of securing our supply chains and reshoring manufacturing. And we all agree we want to do that, but this will not get us there. When manufacturers seek permits to build and operate, they'll have to show their modeled emissions won't tip an area into noncompliance. And as this map shows, vast areas of the nation would risk tipping into noncompliance. The National Association of Manufacturers commissioned a study which indicated that lowering PM2.5 standards to 8 would threaten $87.4 billion in economic activity per year. The study also showed that lowering the PM2.5 standard would lead to the loss of over 300,000 manufacturing jobs annually. The harmful economic impacts of EPA's proposal is staggering, not just for manufacturing, but for all sectors of the economy, from energy to agriculture to transportation. Today, we'll hear from a panel that can help the committee understand the impacts of implementing these proposed standards. Bryce Bird, the state air director for Utah, would be responsible for implementing the EPA standards. And state air regulators are critical to implementing these standards. So Mr. Bird's perspective on the practical challenges states will face to design regulatory and permitting programs and the impacts of lower standards like problems mitigating wildfires will be critical to our examination today. I'd also like to welcome Glenn Hammer, who's involved in business development in Texas and can provide a regional economic perspective. And Tim Hunt will help us understand what industries will confront as they seek the permits to operate. And finally, I'd like to welcome Almeda Cooper of Mom's Clean Air Force to share her perspective today with us as well. It's critical that our hearing today uncovers the real-world impacts of EPA's proposed discretionary tightening of PM 2.5 standards. We have a very knowledgeable panel, and I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses. In closing, let me emphasize that the United States has decreased PM 2.5 emissions by 42% over the past 20 years. We can and will continue to decrease air emissions, but we cannot do so under overly burdensome regulations that are impossible to implement. And with that, I yield back, and I'm pleased now to recognize the ranking member from New York, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for his 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our panelists. Today's hearing is an opportunity to examine EPA's ongoing efforts to protect public health from dangerous air pollution, specifically fine particulate matter, also known as PM 2.5. We know that despite decades of progress to improve air quality in the United States, over 100 million Americans continue to live in areas with unhealthy levels of air pollution. We can do better, and EPA has a legal obligation to guide us in that manner. Particulate matter is one of 6 criteria air pollutants regulated under the Clean Air Act. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, are special because EPA must set them at levels to be protective of health without consideration of costs. EPA does this by conducting a rigorous review of the latest scientific evidence every 5 years to determine whether new standards are necessary to protect our public health. Unfortunately, the previous administration, despite the recommendation from EPA staff and the broader scientific and public health communities, failed to conduct a thorough consideration of the latest science when it chose not to update the standard in 2020. This is just one of many examples of the previous administration's failure to carry out its regulatory agenda based on sound science. I'll repeat that. It's just an example again of the previous administration's failure to carry out its regulatory agenda based on sound science. I know developing environmental protections is an incredibly difficult task, but for the agency to succeed in its mission, it must build its regulatory agenda on strong scientific integrity. So in January of this year, EPA announced that it would strengthen the annual PM 2.5 standard from 12 micrograms per cubic meter to within a range of 9 to 10 micrograms per cubic meter. This decision was not made lightly. It was based on an extensive scientific record in consultation with EPA's independent scientific advisors on the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. A majority of the members of this advisory board recommended a standard between 8 and 10 micrograms per cubic meter. This more stringent standard will provide significant public health benefits, including avoiding 1,700 premature deaths and 110,000 lost workdays in 2032. And the benefits of strengthening the annual standard will far outweigh the costs, resulting in an estimated $17 billion in net benefits in 2032. Now, of course, NAAQS does allow EPA's co-regulators, the states, to take costs and technical feasibility into account when implementing these standards. And that is one of the great strengths of the Clean Air Act. Each state has flexibility to achieve the standard using strategies and pollution control technologies best suited for its unique circumstances. I truly believe that growing the economy and protecting the environment are not at odds, and certainly our manufacturing sector is a critical pillar of our economy. In fact, the linchpin of our national energy transition strategy is our ability to develop the domestic manufacturing capacity for the clean energy technologies that will be deployed here and around the world. But I also believe it is critical that these industries manufacture their products as sustainably and efficiently as possible to avoid putting additional health harms on already overburdened fence-line communities. Mr. Chair, I appreciate today's hearing, but I want to stress from the outset that I strongly support EPA's decision to move forward with strengthening the annual standard for particulate matter. The scientific evidence is clear that the current standard is too weak to adequately protect public health, and for EPA to follow the law and the science, the agency was obligated to pursue this more protective standard. And with that, I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the chair of the full committee, Chair Rodgers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, everyone. For decades, America has been the best place to do business. We've ensured that while also ensuring that we have the highest environmental standards in the world. This has created well-paying jobs for hardworking Americans, driven economic prosperity, and made sure that people have safe and healthy communities to raise a family. America has done more to lift people out of poverty, raise the standard of living more than any other nation in the world. And that prosperity and opportunity is being threatened today. President Biden's radical rush to green agenda is costing us across the board. People are suffering. Every time you go to fill up your car with gas, feed your family, try to keep the lights on. And now the EPA is attempting to take this extreme agenda one step further by proposing unattainable standards on fine particulate matter, or PM2.5. This comes after EPA had already included that the current standards are protective of public health. And this will be devastating for American businesses, people's livelihood, and our economic leadership. As we will hear from witnesses, if EPA finalizes these unrealistic PM standards, there will be far-reaching consequences, including pushing us further on the brink of recession. These standards will make it nearly impossible to build new manufacturing facilities, including the dreams of EV and semiconductors in the USA. It will undermine the work to expand America's manufacturing base, making it impossible to secure our supply chains and build products that people have come to rely on every day. The harm would extend to nearly every sector of our economy as well: power, agriculture, construction, and forestry. Studies indicate that this could jeopardize hundreds of billions of dollars in U.S. economic activity and millions of jobs. The proposed standards could actually make it more difficult to protect people from harmful air pollutants, a fundamental responsibility of the EPA. By all measures, the nation's air quality has improved dramatically since the Clean Air Act was signed into law, and the current standards are improving quality even more. Overall emissions of pollutants regulated by air quality standards have dropped 73% since 1980. Air quality for this particular category today is more than 40% better than just in 2000. All told, U.S. air quality is the best in the world, and it's getting cleaner. Just 3 years ago, the EPA confirmed that the current standards for PM2.5 were protective of public health, following a comprehensive review required by law. Despite this progress, the Biden EPA is taking steps to introduce these new, completely divorced from reality standards. This will force investors and jobs out of the United States, and again, benefit countries like China, the largest polluter in the world with the worst environmental standards, and could make air quality even worse for Americans, as the new limits would prevent the needed management to prevent like wildfires, which cause a lot of the PM emissions. This is reckless, and it's a reckless agenda that's going to crush American manufacturing, is completely unworkable for states and local governments, making it difficult to permit investments in their communities and grow their local economies. Behind me are the maps that show the current standard and the counties that are open for manufacturing, and then what would be red is non-attainment, no permits, and the pink would be very difficult. A fifth of the U.S. counties would find that they're not in compliance with these most radical levels that the EPA is proposing. They'll be gridlocked with new regulations and controls, losing opportunities to improve the lives of people. Even areas that meet standards will be unable to permit expanded or new manufacturing and industry. And depending on the levels of these new standards, these burdens could extend across much of the nation, including the most economically active areas of the country. What we see is that the regulatory burden, the restrictions being put in place are crushing our economy, making it impossible to create economic opportunity. It is not how the Clean Air Act was meant to be used. We need to stay focused on the real goal, and the real goal is continued American economic leadership while ensuring that we have clean and safe communities for all people and their families. This is how we've led for decades, and it's how we will continue to be the world leader in reducing emissions, improving air quality, lifting people out of poverty, raising the standard of living. I welcome our witnesses today who are going to provide important testimony. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we will be discussing the Environmental Protection Agency's proposed National Ambient Air Quality Standards for Fine Particulate Matter, or the PM2.5 NAAQS. This proposal is a welcome update to outdated standards and is critical to reducing dangerous air pollution and protecting communities across the nation. Fine particulate matter poses a significant health risk to communities, including increased rates of heart disease, serious respiratory impacts, and even death. It can be emitted into the air from power plants, industrial facilities, and vehicles, but it can also come from construction sites, unpaved roads, fields, smokestacks, or fires. Even short-term exposure for hours or days can cause aggravated asthma attacks, acute bronchitis, and increased susceptibility to respiratory infections. And we know that these impacts are even more acute in sensitive populations, like children, pregnant women, the elderly, and underserved communities. Since 1970, the Clean Air Act has directed the EPA to set health-based air quality standards based solely on the latest science and medical evidence. NAAQS essentially sets the level of pollution that is safe to breathe. States then develop plans to control pollution and meet these goals. Cost and technological feasibility are front and center in this planning. States can identify which pollution control measures are best suited to meeting the standard in the most cost-effective ways. And this structure has been extraordinarily effective for over 50 years in cleaning the air and protecting public health, including the health of sensitive groups. The Trump administration shirked its duty to protect public health by retaining the current outdated standard for fine particulate matter. This decision went against the recommendations of experts and the science. And when President Biden came into office, his administration revisited the standard to ensure that the health of American communities are protected. And this is something the EPA is required to do. Following careful review of the scientific evidence and consulting with the agency's independent scientific advisors, EPA recently proposed to strengthen the fine particulate matter NAAQS. The proposal would prevent at least 1,700 deaths and provide $17 billion in net public health benefits in 2032. This would be an incredible win for the American people. Unfortunately, committee Republicans want to keep the status quo. They simply have no interest in protecting people's health and instead want to protect industry and polluters. Republicans are essentially saying that we must choose between cleaner air and a strong economy, and they are wrong. We do not have to choose. We can have both. In fact, we have achieved both under the Clean Air Act, which has shown time and again that strong environmental safeguards and strong economic growth go hand in hand. Between 1970 and 2022, air pollutant emissions dropped by 78%, while our nation's gross domestic product has nearly quadrupled. While Republicans have failed to offer any practical solutions to address the serious threat of air pollution, Democrats are fighting for workers and families. While Republicans are pushing their just say no policies, Democrats are making investments into clean technologies that will grow our economy and foster a more sustainable future. And while Republicans are willing to let air pollution go unchecked as part of their polluters over people agenda, Democrats are advocating for strong science-based standards that put the health of Americans first. Because let's be honest, a person's health is not and should not be a bargaining chip. But House Republicans are putting American lives at risk by supporting the status quo on NAAQS and by proposing a 39% cut to EPA's budget. Of course, they are finding it impossible to bring any appropriation bills to fund the government to the floor because they are repeatedly caving to the extreme elements in their party. And now they are threatening a government shutdown at the end of this month that would hurt American families. Instead of undermining the law and gutting the EPA, we should provide adequate resources to the agency and to the states to continue to give every American clean, healthy air to breathe. And I yield back with that, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back, and now let's welcome our panelists, our witnesses today. Mr. Bryce Bird is the director at the Division of Air Quality at the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. Mr. Bird, welcome. Mr. Glenn Hammer, am I saying that right? Hammer or Hammer? Hammer. The president and CEO of the Texas Association of Business. Mr. Hammer, thank you. Ms. Almeida, do I have that correct? Cooper, the national manager of health equity at Mom's Clean Air Force. Welcome, Ms. Cooper. And Mr. Tim Hunt, senior director of air quality programs at the American Forest and Paper Association. Mr. Bird, you get to go first. You're now recognized for your 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, Chair Rodgers, and Ranking Member Pallone. As I mentioned, my name is Bryce Bird. I'm the director of the Utah Division of Air Quality and the current past president of the Association of Air Pollution Control Agencies. I'm here to provide a state perspective on EPA's recently proposed revisions to the annual National Ambient Air Quality Standard for fine particulate matter PM2.5. I will also provide some context about the impacts of those changes on how we must regulate businesses and manufacturing within our potential non-attainment areas in the near future. Particulate air pollution is a major health concern in Utah. The foundational correlation studies that linked particulate pollution levels with health outcomes began in Utah. It is clear that the burden of particulate air pollution should be reduced, and it is also clear that past regulatory actions in Utah have resulted in lower pollutant concentrations and corresponding health benefits. Air pollution has been a focus of regulatory actions in Utah since the early 1900s. Utah has unique challenges with topography and meteorology that enhance and trap particulate pollution in the mountain valleys that contain the population centers of the state. Despite these challenges, the state has successfully attained each of the past particulate standards. Because of this long history of addressing multiple national ambient air quality standards, the strategies in Utah have resulted in levels of control that are beyond those required in many other areas of the country. Recent state implementation planning rulemaking has required the installation of retrofit controls on existing industrial sources that cost the companies in excess of $40,000 per ton of emissions reduced. Despite these past efforts, EPA's proposed new standards for annual PM2.5 will require looking again to develop a new state plan to address this new standard. Once under the scope of non-attainment, the permitting of major sources of emissions becomes infeasible due to the requirements for offsetting new emissions through retirement of credits under emissions trading programs. Transportation improvements are at risk of failing to conform with new air quality requirements that will impact the ability of a state to respond to the demands for roads resulting from growth. In short, the mandatory requirements of the Clean Air Act for an area that has a long history of emissions reductions result in more costly and less effective controls that target a very small portion of the remaining inventory that states can directly regulate. I'll provide a few examples to highlight the need for adjustments to these requirements that EPA has in place. SIP requirements should address the sources that can actually be regulated under a state implementation plan. Sources of air pollution that are beyond the regulatory control of a state, such as forest fires and transported background emissions, overwhelm the emission sources that Utah has the authority to regulate. As has been evident throughout the country this year, the drying west and forest fuel loading has resulted in lengthy wildfire impacts and increased impacts from prescribed fires that are necessary to reduce the fuel load. Past forest management decisions have increased the rate and scope of wildfires on federally managed forests. Monitored levels of air pollution during wildfire smoke events are tens to hundreds of times higher than are typically attributable to local regulated sources in Utah. The inability to effectively control sources also occurs within the non-attainment areas. Utah is preempted from requiring controls on mobile sources under the Clean Air Act. This represents the largest component of the emissions that are responsible for our non-attainment within these counties. The second largest category are the area sources that include consumer and commercial activities of homes, institutions, and businesses. There are a few reasonably available controls that are effective at reducing area source emissions beyond what Utah has already required. And the remaining major source industries, the smokestack industries, represent only about 13% of the inventory and have already been subject to many years of regulatory controls. At the same time, there are pollutant reduction requirements for some national air quality standards that the state must implement even if the reduction of that pollutant doesn't help the airshed to attain the standard. Naturally, a law that underwent its last major revisions over 30 years ago needs to be updated periodically to fit the current regulatory landscape. In closing, the Utah Department of Environmental Quality is committed to protecting the health of our citizens through attaining air quality standards. We work closely with our communities and impact businesses to reduce emissions while providing the goods and services necessary for a vibrant and growing economy. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions or comments you have regarding my testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. Gentleman yields back. Mr. Hammer, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Hammer, I'm sorry. Could you check your microphone there? Thank you very much. And pull it as close as you can.
My apologies, Mr.
I'm
Chairman.
probably the only one up here wearing hearing aids, and I can't hear you.
I'm the guy that puts the mute on when we're on Zoom, so my apologies. Appreciate the chance to speak here today, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, and members of the committee. This is a very important committee hearing on protecting American manufacturing, and I really appreciated the opening remarks of Chair Rodgers. I believe that those were right on the mark, and she really identified the stakes that we're facing today. And I appreciate the chance to be here to discuss the effects on the broader manufacturing community, working closely with the National Association of Manufacturers as its official state partner. You probably all know for the last 25 years or so, the Texas economy has been on a tear. We have a $2.3 trillion GDP. We officially surpassed Italy as the 8th largest economy in the world, if you were ranking us as a country, and Texas is really a country. Not only are we #1 for corporate headquarter relocations, we now have more Fortune 500 companies than any other state. We're up to 55. We're also the top exporting state. We export more energy and semiconductors and technology goods than any other state. And I say all of these things because the health of the Texas economy is vitally important for the health of the American economy. And because of the health of the economy, we boast a $33 billion budget surplus, which is now being invested in broadband, clean water, roadways, and other vital infrastructure components that could be negatively impacted by more stringent EPA rules. Our members are facing a regulatory onslaught, which includes numerous proposed federal environmental regulations that, if finalized in their current form, can cause serious harm to our economy. Manufacturers have worked with the EPA and their state partners to significantly lower PM2.5 and other pollutants. Yet EPA has proposed a discretionary regulation on PM2.5 that could put nearly 40% of the U.S. population in areas of non-attainment, putting jobs and livelihoods at risk. And those two charts that were originally behind you, Mr. Chairman, they were scary. I saw pink and red over the entire state of Texas, as well as most of California and New York as well. EPA's most recent data shows that PM2.5 concentrations have declined by 42% since 2000. We've been making a ton of progress. And this is driven by major emissions restrictions, reductions from both mobile sources and the power sector. This is driven by the free market economy, by our great manufacturers across this great country that are doing everything possible to lower emissions. The data also shows, as was just mentioned, that the vast majority of remaining PM2.5 emissions in the U.S., 84%, now come from wildfires, road dust, and other non-point sources. And as we've seen this year, wildfires have a demonstrable effect on air quality in the U.S. I'm going to close by reading a couple of quotes from our partners. The Greater Houston Partnership, just to see how some of what the EPA is doing really could hurt some other goals that I believe many on this committee share. The Greater Houston Partnership, in discussing its opposition to the new EPA proposed rules, I say in quotes, Houston companies are investing billions in clean technology and climate tech. It's estimated that around $15 billion of energy transition-related investment flowed into Houston in 2021. However, the proposed standards could jeopardize momentum in the energy transition by demeaning our regional competitiveness and diverting capital investment into costly permitting procedures. The North Texas Commission, which represents the North Texas area, which has an economy right now that exceeds Virginia by itself, also registered its concerns. Mr. Chairman, I'll close by saying we all share similar goals. We want clean air, we want good jobs, we want to be more competitive in the great power competition with China. I commend you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. We need to protect American manufacturing, and the direction the EPA is going would unfortunately do just the opposite. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hammer. The gentleman yields back. Ms. Cooper, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Rodgers, Chair Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, and Ranking Member Pallone. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Almeta Cooper. I'm the National Manager for Health Equity for Moms Clean Air Force. We're a national organization of 1.5 million moms, dads, and caregivers who are dedicated to protecting clean air and children's health. As an African American, a mother, and a member of Moms Clean Air Force, I'm here today because nothing is more important than the health of our families and communities. Under the Clean Air Act, the Environmental Protection Agency is required to use the best available science to set air quality standards that are protective of human health. Moms Clean Air Force believes it is imperative that the EPA follow the science and enact strong safeguards. It is a legal duty, and we believe that everyone has a right to breathe clean air. Particle pollution is produced by, among other things, the burning of fossil fuels for energy. Major sources include industrial smokestacks and vehicle exhaust, and because these particles are so tiny, they can be inhaled into our lungs and enter our bloodstream, where they can cause serious health effects, including heart disease, cancer, compromised immunity, asthma, and even adverse pregnancy and birth outcomes. Particle pollution, or PM2.5, is also a leading cause of premature death. In the U.S., researchers estimate that PM2.5 is responsible for well over 100,000 deaths each year, a staggering toll for families and communities around the country. And the public burden of PM2.5 is not distributed evenly. In the U.S., people of color, particularly Black and Latino communities, are disproportionately exposed to this dangerous pollutant. People of color are more than 6 times more likely to visit the emergency room for asthma-related issues. Black children are more than 7 times more likely to die from asthma than white children, and Black Americans 65 years and older are 3 times more likely to die from exposure to soot than white Americans over 65. These inequities are patently unjust. I ask the members of the committee to remember that the statistics that you hear today are tied to real people all over this country. Particle pollution hurts families everywhere. Real people like Hazel Chandler have shared their real-life experience with Moms Clean Air Force. She is a great-grandmother in Arizona who has lived in cities with failing grades for air pollution throughout her adult life. The cumulative impacts are threatening to cut her life short as she now experiences asthma, immune dysfunction, and stage 4 cancer. And Shayna Oliver, an indigenous mom in Colorado who was born on a Navajo reservation surrounded by pollution sources like coal plants and oil and gas operations. Like other children on the reservation, she was born prematurely and low birth weight, and as an infant, she was diagnosed with asthma and struggled to breathe when the air quality was poor. And Mercedes McKinley is a Latina mom who lives in Nevada, whose home is located near a major highway. Her air filters have to be replaced monthly instead of the typical 3 months because soot and other particles build up, and if she doesn't wipe it down, a black film is on her air vents. And Patrice Tomczyk, who lives in Pennsylvania, a state with the highest rate of particle pollution deaths per capita. Her community is located near many polluting sources, an interstate connector, a steel plant, and now a Shell petrochemical plant. She worries about the dirty air that her son, a pediatric cancer survivor, is breathing. Hazel, Shayna, Mercedes, and Patrice's stories represent the stories of millions of real people whose everyday lives are impacted by particle pollution. children with asthma who struggle to breathe when the air quality is poor, mothers whose pregnancies and babies are endangered by unhealthy air, and older adults whose families grieve when they die before their time. In closing, I urge the members of the subcommittee to remember the children, neighbors, friends, and families who are being harmed by unhealthy air. Also, I urge members to remember that the law mandates that the EPA set standards that are protective of public health. The mandate specifies public health because safeguarding the health of our families and communities is of the utmost importance. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Hunt, you are now recognized for your 5-minute statement.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Tonko, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Timothy Hunt, and I'm the Senior Director of Air Quality Programs, the American Forest and Paper Association, and the American Wood Council. Thank you for hearing our concerns about EPA's proposed NAAQS for fine particulate matter. AF&PA represents manufacturers of paper products, and AWC represents manufacturers of structural wood products made in America. The forest products industry employs about 925,000 hardworking Americans, producing 5% of our nation's GDP. Our mills support the American workforce, produce carbon-neutral bioenergy, and provide essential products that support recycling and sequester carbon in the built environment. Each day, the paper and wood products industry works hard to be a leader in sustainability and good stewards in communities across our nation. We recognize that all Americans benefit when EPA crafts achievable rules. Our shared goal is sustainable regulation that satisfies legal, supports environmental and economic progress, and will stand the test of time. To that end, Congress enacted the Clean Air Act to enhance air quality with dual purposes: to promote public health and welfare, and to promote the productive capacity of our nation. Unfortunately, EPA's proposed premature tightening of the PM NAAQS without a workable implementation plan does not fulfill those dual purposes. It is a recipe for permitting gridlock. It threatens modernization projects in manufacturing sectors across the U.S., especially in areas with cleaner air, and it would undermine the President's promise to grow and reshore U.S. manufacturing jobs. EPA is rushing this rulemaking process. The agency wants to tighten the current PM standard close to ambient air background levels without a clear path to achieve it. This is a discretionary rule, 2 years ahead of the normal statutory review cycle. This would mean many more non-attainment areas, but even cleaner attainment areas, there would be insufficient permit headroom. That is the margin between the NAAQS standard and ambient background concentrations for permits to be approved. It is alarming that EPA has not developed an implementation plan in advance to avoid this permitting gridlock. We have asked and continue to ask the agency to develop a practical plan. We need an achievable plan, providing realistic modeling and permitting tools to accurately reflect real-world conditions and address all PM sources, industrial and non-industrial. We need an achievable plan. Our industry faces an EPA catch-22. Paper and wood products mills often are located in cleaner attainment areas, and ironically, EPA's practice is that the tougher NAAQS applies in those areas immediately when issued. This will hurt facilities that want to make major upgrades that could provide lower emissions per ton of production, including reductions in PM, greenhouse gases, and other emissions. A premature NAAQS will hurt U.S. manufacturing global competitiveness. It will stifle innovation for our industry and lead to unintended outcomes for our environment. We are asking the EPA, once again, to work with us on an achievable and credible implementation plan. We also must recognize that a cumulative regulatory challenge now faces the U.S. manufacturing sector. Many rulemakings disregard unintended outcomes and stray beyond the bounds of the law. We are deeply concerned that an undisciplined regulatory deluge threatens our workforce. If we do not change our trajectory, ultimately, what is at stake are American jobs. Men and women with high-paying, high-skilled union jobs, both rural and urban, in red and blue states. These are proud, hardworking people who only ask for the right to compete. This requires bipartisan work. There's no better place than America for a robust manufacturing sector. We respectfully submit that EPA should not finalize the NAAQS until it develops a workable implementation plan that has been fully vetted, a sentiment the United Steelworkers expressed in their comments to EPA as well. Thank you for the opportunity to be heard. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. The gentleman yields back. We will now begin our questioning, and I will begin by yielding myself 5 minutes. And let me thank our panelists again for being here with us today. You know, the impacts of the EPA's proposed PM2.5 standards, they're going to be harmful for many of the most economically active areas in our nation, from Texas across the South and up through the industrial centers of the Midwest, including my state of Ohio. The very areas that are helping to restore and reshore American manufacturing and industry. And we should all recognize that setting a new air quality standard does not immediately equal cleaner air. Even if they were reasonable standards, they must be implemented by the states and by the facilities responsible for emissions. This is difficult for facilities that have already implemented the best available controls and made even more difficult when emission standards are set so close to background levels. So, Mr. Byrd, let me start with you, if I might. As a state official who must implement any new standards, would you briefly outline the implementation actions and rough timelines for states like yours when the EPA issues new standards like this for PM 2.5?
Well, thank you. The Clean Air Act and the implementing regulations are, of course, a robust set of laws that the states must comply with. They outline the timing. So the Clean Air Act defines some of the mandatory requirements, the timing. So once an area is designated as non-attainment, we have 18 months to go through the planning process. Of course, there's an initial step there as well that identifies that the states provide information about which areas should be declared non-attainment and the boundaries based on the air emissions inventory, the political subdivisions that are impacted there. Once the area is designated as non-attainment, we have 18 months to create a plan, and then we bring the area back into compliance. The permitting process is a part of that. So we develop control requirements for sources that are impacting that non-attainment. And of course, I think as has been mentioned here, one of the challenges is that it is not tied to the actual sources of air pollution that are responsible for that non-attainment. It's often what we have the ability to regulate, and then regulating those over and over again. Ultimately, it is a 20-year process to bring the area back into attainment with increasing controls if you're not meeting the standard over time.
Okay. You know, Ohio's officials responsible for implementing the standards have raised concern to the EPA about incomplete data, problems and biases in the air monitoring and other issues that the EPA has failed to resolve before moving forward. Mr. Byrd, do you share my state, Ohio's concerns that the EPA should update its modeling and identify implementation options more completely for the states to be able to implement any new limits?
Yes. For a particular form of monitoring, there are federal reference method monitors that don't achieve the same reliability as the federal reference, the federal reference method standards. And so EPA is going through the process of reviewing those. That was something that was required of the states to use these equivalent methods, and they seem to be over-reporting. And so EPA needs to address that as part of this effort to validate the data and make sure that we are able to attain the standard.
Okay. The EPA produced its proposal without doing this work. It also was actually unable to identify all the controls that would give you and other states the ability to come into compliance with those standards. Just a yes or no, you agree with that?
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Hunt, in your testimony, you provided maps and estimates of how permitting, which is already complex, lengthy, and overly burdensome, will be stifled across the nation. Would you walk us through the maps and what they tell us?
Sure. The maps, the areas of green on those maps are areas where investment opportunities are still available and welcome. And as was pointed out, the red areas are the non-attainment areas. And the interesting aspect of those maps is the large amount of areas that are pink. These are the areas, the cleaner areas, that meet the standard, but there's insufficient headroom. There's insufficient room for many projects to be able to be permitted and move forward. We've done a lot of analysis, and a typical project takes, according to current procedures, about 3 micrograms per cubic meter of emissions. So if the standard gets lowered to even 10, any area with background levels of 7 would find it very challenging to permit those projects. And those are important modernization projects. They're projects that could actually reduce emissions and are already putting on best emission controls. So they're very, very clean relative to current control standards.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. I'd like to continue this, but my time has expired. I do have some other questions, and I will either get some time yielded to me to go back to those, or I'll send those to you for further consideration. I yield back, and now I recognize the gentleman from New York, the ranking member, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Cooper, I mentioned in my opening statement that it appears that the previous administration really did not follow the science when they chose not to revisit the annual fine particulate matter standard. There was significant scientific literature that the existing standard was not adequately protective, and the public health and scientific communities, as well as EPA's own career staff, had suggested as much. So, Ms. Cooper, can you talk about the importance of EPA's public health regulations being based on the best available science, especially the NACs, which are not supposed to consider non-health factors?
Thank you, Ranking Member Tonko. The EPA needs to rely on the science because we're talking about the public health, and we're talking about families, we're talking about our friends and neighbors. The kinds of stories that I've shared this morning with you are real stories of how people's health has been exacerbated by pollution, and you don't want to take that lightly because of the seriousness of the matter. And also, it's very clear that under the Clean Air Act that the EPA is required to take into consideration protecting human health. I don't know how I can say that any more clearer, but that is why it's important, and that's why it has to be a scientific basis.
Thank you. And I know you work with many, many moms that care about public health. You've been active in a number of efforts to achieve those goals. Many of these people are not scientists themselves, but should they have an expectation that EPA's decisions on whether or not to move forward with environmental protections are indeed based on sound science?
Yes, yes.
And so what does the average American think when they hear that the EPA's career staff or the Independent Scientific Advisory Board had been ignored?
Well, what we hear from the many people across the country who are members of Moms Clean Air Force is that they expect to be able to rely on the EPA to protect human health, to make sure that the standards are protective. And also, I just want to point out that the standards relate to health and not to other types of factors. So that's the reason why, especially if, like me, you're over 65 and you know that that's a high-risk area, you want to be able to rely on the EPA to make sure that our health is protected.
Well, I hear you, and I agree. I think it's important to remember that EPA's decisions to strengthen this standard now was done with the support of the agency's career experts, as well as the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee. This issue of improving scientific integrity at our federal agencies is not unique to one party or one administration. There are sadly too many examples of regulatory decisions made for political and special interests rather than being driven by what we believe is sound science. So that is why I think all agencies should adopt stronger and enforceable scientific integrity policies and heed the advice of their independent science advisory boards. It's how it should function. So with that, I thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back.
Mr. Tonko yields. Now I'd like to recognize the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Rodgers. Recognize her for 5 minutes for questions.
The air quality today has improved dramatically in levels since 1990. That was when Congress last amended the Clean Air Act to direct EPA on how to address air quality issues. And our air quality keeps improving as states continue to implement existing standards and permit new manufacturing, and as manufacturers themselves continue to innovate and produce goods more efficiently and with the latest emissions technologies. This is the good news. The bad news, as the testimony shows today, is that EPA is rushing a proposal for radical PM2.5 standards closer to background levels that risk destroying economic growth across regions of our nation. What is clear from the testimony is that EPA knows it has not done all the work states and businesses would need to successfully meet a new standard, whatever the level. Yet, it rushed the proposal anyway. That is irresponsible and is unacceptable. Mr. Hunt, the data you use in your testimony and these maps, I had maps here. They're pretty dramatic. These maps that I referenced earlier. Yes, here we go. That's today. And this is, I'm taking time, but anyway, okay, they're getting the maps. Okay, this is EPA modeling. Mr. Hunt, is that correct?
These maps are looking at the monitors that are out there across the United States, and we don't have monitors, unfortunately, in all the counties, so trying to project what the background level would be. And so what these maps show is that as the standard gets lower, with our current implementation strategies, many projects would not be able to be permitted. We've looked at
Thank you. Next, to illustrate the economic harm, would you briefly explain what would have happened to your industry members if EPA set this standard at current proposed levels 5 or 6 years ago?
A lot of the projects, we've looked at about 36 permits that have recently gone through the process, and at 8 micrograms or even at 10, half to 80% of those projects would fail. They would not be able to be permitted under the procedures that EPA currently use.
Thank you. How would the EPA PM2.5 proposal impact forest and paper facilities in Washington State, my home state?
Any modernization project at mills in your state or across the country would find it very challenging to invest, modernize, compete in the global marketplace, support the high-paying union jobs that we're very proud of, and make the environment in our communities cleaner, because as we modernize our facilities, we're also improving the air quality because we're putting on best available control technologies.
Thank you, Mr.
So we
Hunt.
share that goal.
Thank you. Mr. Byrd, another harmful effect of these proposals concerns the ability to manage forests and other areas with prescribed burns to reduce wildfire risks, which account for almost half of the PM2.5 emissions. This is a problem under the current structure of the Clean Air Act, and with existing PM2.5 standards, how do the EPA proposals to further ratchet down PM2.5 standards make wildfire management even harder?
As you pointed out, one of the best ways to manage fire is actually with fire, and that is prescribed fires, making sure that you're doing it in a controlled time of the year, under the right prescription so that they won't become wildfires. That becomes a regulatory activity for the state, and with the new standards approaching it right now in our decision-making, we look at the current air quality, we look at the potential impacts on the regulatory monitors, and that is part of our decision-making whether or not to approve those prescribed fires for forest management now.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd, Mr. Hunt. I'd like to ask you both, if the EPA administrator uses his discretion to withdraw the proposed PM 2.5 standards, like he did with the ozone 3 weeks ago, and conducts a thorough review and completes EPA's work on implementation, would that provide a better outcome for air quality? Very quickly, please, Mr. Byrd.
Yes.
Mr. Hunt?
Yes, and it would give EPA time to develop a realistic and workable implementation plan that would not result in this permitting gridlock.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here. At a time when America leads the world in clean air standards, I'm very, very concerned. We want to build more manufacturing plants. We want to build more electric vehicle plants right now, semiconductor plants. This is just one more example where that's not going to happen in the United States. It won't be possible. It only is an advantage to China. I urge the EPA to pull back on this radical proposal. I yield back.
Chairman Rodgers yields back. I now recognize Ranking Member Pallone for his questions for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Some of my colleagues are quick to argue that EPA's proposed fine particulate matter standard will hurt the economy, but history tells us that's a false choice. Since its enactment in 1970, the Clean Air Act provides a perfect example of how we can make steady progress in cleaning up the air while enjoying economic growth. So, Ms. Cooper, do we have to choose between clean air and economic growth?
No, I don't believe we do. And in fact, when you think about it, there's a lot of documentation in the scientific reports about how many people are required to go to emergency rooms and get medical care because of the impacts of poor air quality. And any time that our workforce is not healthy, they are not at work, and if they have to be in an emergency room with their loved one or themselves to get care. So I don't believe that we have to choose. I believe that whatever choice we do make, however, that it has to take into consideration the many, many people who are impacted. And in fact, without stronger standards, some of the scientific reports suggest that there will be even a higher death rate. We're already talking about 100,000 deaths per year related to PM 2.5.
Well, obviously, I agree with you, and that's the success story of the Clean Air Act. When we're talking about air pollution regulation, my Republican colleagues often focus on costs, specifically the cost to polluters of cleaning up their act, but they ignore the costs associated with exposures to unsafe air faced by communities across the country. And I believe this concentration on polluters' costs is misguided. Over the history of the Clean Air Act, industry has consistently exaggerated the potential costs of controlling pollution while downplaying the legitimate costs that air pollution puts on communities. So let me ask you again, Ms. Cooper, could you shed some light on the cost of air pollution to communities?
Again, the cost to the health of our communities, to our most vulnerable people within our communities, to children. Children, unfortunately, because of their developing bodies, are at greater risk than adults are. They're not little adults. They're developing their lungs, and therefore they're more susceptible. Pregnant women, there are documented evidence related to the birth outcomes related to pregnant women, and there's recent studies that even link breast cancer to particle pollution. So all of those costs, those human health costs, are very dramatic. I don't know many people who would trade their loved one for dollars.
Well, thank you again. And I mean, these costs are real and have significant impacts on our families and our children across the nation. It comes as no surprise to me that a majority of Americans on a bipartisan basis support clean air. According to recent polling by the American Lung Association, 74% of Americans generally support EPA updating standards with stricter limits on air pollution. So I wanted to ask unanimous consent to enter the polling from the American Lung Association into record, Mr. Chairman, if I could. And you have a copy? I'll give you a copy.
Well, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Let me ask Ms. Cooper again, in your work, have you found that the idea of cleaner air is popular with communities?
The idea of cleaner air is very popular, and in fact, when the EPA held its hearings, there were over 62 members of Moms Clean Air Force volunteers across the country who testified. So it's very popular, and as you mentioned, through research and documentation by the American Lung Association and others, it's been shown that voters believe that clean air is important. In my immediately past home state of Georgia, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution did a study that showed that 70% of the voters in Georgia supported clean air irrespective of party.
Well, I think we can all agree that no one should have unhealthy air, and that's why I support EPA's efforts to set stronger science-based fine particulate matter, NAAQS. We know this pollution is dangerous for public health, and EPA must ensure that the NAAQS are health protective. It's clear that the science indicates that the current standard is inadequate, and I think we owe it to the American people to ensure there's a strong standard in place. So thank you again, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Carter from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. Ms. Cooper, it's good to see you. I think we're neighbors in Atlanta, and I appreciate you being here. It's very important that we have advocates and we have input from all of you. You know, we have some of the cleanest air in the world right here in the United States. Even the EPA says that, and we're very fortunate. Yet, I'm troubled by this because, Ms. Cooper, you know Georgia, and you know South Georgia. We're very rural. And in fact, Georgia's the #1 forestry state in the nation. A lot of trees that serve as carbon sinks. In fact, we've got a saying in South Georgia. We say, whenever you breathe fresh air, get down on your knees and thank the farmer who planted the trees. And it's true. They serve as carbon sinks, and it's extremely important. But I'm concerned because we need economic development too. I'm concerned about the fact that this is pretty extreme, and the impact that it's going to have on development, particularly in the rural areas, particularly in South Georgia. And I'm concerned too about, how smart we're being about this. I mean, for example, California. We know California has imposed some of the strictest emission limits in the world, and some of the strictest environmental standards in the nation. Yet a recent study found that wildfire emissions in 2020 essentially negated 18 years of reductions in GHG emissions from other sectors by a factor of 2. It would appear that we would concentrate our efforts on that more so if we were going to be able to really address this issue. I want to ask you, Mr. Hunt, I'll start with you. I want to ask you, what would be the impact on rural areas that become in non-attainment because of these proposed standards? I mean, if you look at the map behind me, you see we've already got some areas of non-attainment. If these standards come in place, what's going to be the impact on rural areas, particularly on a district like mine in South Georgia?
I mean, the irony with the way the EPA program is set up is in those cleaner areas, the impacts hit immediately. So one of our concerns is having a time frame for implementing any new standard that is sufficient to allow for transition to have a plan to let economic growth continue. So mills and other facilities would find it very challenging to modernize, expand, make new products in those areas.
Well, what about the areas that are already in non-attainment? Are they going to see improvements?
Any facility that's built or expanded in those areas will have already the top of the line air pollution control. So the air quality from those facilities will improve or will be addressed as a result of those controls. Our facilities already have a lot of particulate matter controls already. We've made substantial progress over the decades in reducing emissions. So, we're wanting to be responsible citizens within our own communities, making sure that air quality is well protected.
Well, what about the impact? I mean, you said in your testimony that these standards threaten modernization projects that would already improve operations. What about the impact on manufacturing in the U.S.? You know, we just recently had announced, and it's under construction now, the largest single economic development project in the history of the state of Georgia in my district, and that is EV factory. And we've got EV battery factories in Georgia. We've really embraced this. And what's going to be the impact on them? Will the federal support that they've received in recent years ensure that they meet the stringent permitting requirements?
If the standard goes down to 8 or certainly even down to 10, a lot of those projects would be in jeopardy. We've looked at several dozen facilities, and a large percentage of them would not be able to demonstrate attainment, again, because the standard goes into effect immediately and there's no sort of transition plan.
This is the concern that a lot of us in Congress have is we've got so many different agencies making so many different, and look, we all want clean air, of course we do, and Ms. Cooper, you talked about the impact it has on our health and the health of our children. And you know, we want to make sure that that's right, but we got to be smart about these things. I mean, here we are pumping all this money into battery plants and EVs, and now you're telling me it's going to be jeopardized by another rule that another agency's making.
And the emissions these days are very small percentages from traditional industrial stationary sources. Wildfires are a huge source of emissions. So we want, you know, EPA to come up with a much more holistic plan to look at sources as we address air quality issues. And we face, again, a global competition where other countries don't have the same environmental standards that we do.
Well, I'm just asking us to be practical and realistic. And thank you all for being here, and thank you for your testimony, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. According to a Harvard study, 350,000 people each year prematurely die in the United States of America because of the emissions that we have, fossil fuel emissions. And the study lists Illinois, my state, as one of the states that has the highest impact, the highest number of deaths per capita because of the air quality. And so I'm really engaged personally because of my communities in making sure that we do better. And if you look at what the EU has done, is now moving toward a 5 per, what is it? 5 what is it? Micrograms, there it is, I'm sorry. Micrograms per cubic meter standard, 5. And what we're talking about now in the United States of America is we're at 12 right now, and what is being considered is somewhere between 8 and 10, which seems to be very reasonable to me. Now, I want to thank you, Ms. Cooper, for what you're doing with Mom's Clean Air Force, and I appreciate that very much. But also, you have done some focus on what happens to communities of color and low-income communities. And I know we're talking about this debate on whether or not we're going to be hurting jobs in the United States, and that somehow the supply chain isn't going to be there, and the threats that we have. We heard some pretty strong threats about what industry is going to do and the terrible consequences. But I want to say that there are some real-life consequences as well in lots of communities that also affect the economy. When people, 350,000 perhaps, early deaths, and there are people that are getting sick, and yes, it may have some effect because of the fires that they are seeing, but why wouldn't we also, as industry and as consumers and as people, say we can do better to save lives? What happens in communities then is that the healthcare costs go up, people lose days at work, there's a cost to the economy because of that. And I'm just wondering if we can somehow, in this conversation, balance what we're hearing from industry with what we're also hearing from communities and care a bit more. And so I wanted to ask you, Ms. Cooper, to respond to that kind of balance that I'd like to see.
Well, one of the things I think is important to remember is that the EPA standards are not based on how many areas would already be in attainment. EPA sets its standards following the science and considering public health. There's also plenty of documentation, and I mentioned earlier about the number of deaths every year that are directly related to PM2.5. I think 100,000 deaths is an unsustainable and unacceptable cost, and we appreciate the fact that the EPA is moving forward to make standards that will continue to protect health and be even stronger.
You know, I just, you know, this idea of gloom and doom that industry cannot accommodate, that jobs, that we're not going to have any construction going on, that they're going to give. I think that pessimistic view of what happens if we make our air cleaner is just overstated, and I just really feel strongly that we have to balance the ability for us to stay healthy, breathing in the atmosphere, and making sure that we have industry able to make sure that our supply chain is working. I think we can do both, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce, Dr. Joyce, for 5 minutes.
First, I want to thank Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Tonka for holding today's important hearing on EPA's proposed PM 2.5 rule and the witnesses for appearing here today. There is a worrying trend in the EPA of extreme regulations and government overreach. We have seen this trend continue through different administrations, Supreme Court case losses, and congressional oversight. The EPA needs to stop acting like it operates in a vacuum and start to recognize the real-world effects that it has on everyday American families. Sadly, I don't see that happening under the Biden administration. Instead of working with businesses to provide regulatory certainty so they can invest in new economic development, the Biden administration has weaponized the EPA to go after job creators. The EPA's proposed PM 2.5 rule is a great example of this pattern. I appreciate the witnesses, particularly Mr. Hunt from the paper industry, for attending the hearing to inform Congress about what this rule will mean for constituents. My home state of Pennsylvania, and especially in my district, is home to a strong paper industry. Companies like Nittany Paper and American Eagle Paper Products are part of the bedrock of their communities. Pennsylvanians are proud of the steel, glass, aluminum, and coal that our state has produced for generations. Now, thanks to the Marcellus Shale Revolution, Pennsylvania is providing reliable and affordable natural gas to the nation. EPA's predatory regulations like PM 2.5 will put all of these industries at risk, illustrated in the maps behind me right now. This is why the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce sent a letter to the EPA in 2019 opposing this rule. Instead of attacking businesses, we need to work with them so that they are able to continue to create the family-sustaining jobs across our nation. My first question is for you, Mr. Hunt. I understand that for the first time in any national ambient air quality standards proceeding, EPA has not even attempted to model costs to fully attain its stringent standards. Instead, EPA only models to partial attainment. Why do you think the EPA was unable to assemble sufficient control options to demonstrate attainment with any of the proposed standards?
One of the reasons is we're at a very different point in our air quality journey. We've made significant reductions in our traditional stationary sources. They represent about 16% of the total emissions. And so as a society, we need to look more holistically at the emissions from wildfires, from road dust, other sources that are not part of our air quality reduction strategies. And so there are not the easy, low-hanging fruit that there has been in the past. The paper industry, for example, has state-of-the-art air pollution controls on our facilities. And so there's very little additional reductions that can be achieved there. Same with other manufacturing sectors. So we really need to be looking at much more different strategies, and that's part of what additional time would provide. EPA could look at other sources, look at it in a way that protects public health, but also protects the productive capacity of our economy.
And I think that is a balancing act that can definitely be attained. Mr. Hunt, how can other agencies or the public provide complete comments on a partial cost estimate? Doesn't EPA's failure to show how these areas can attain suggest that EPA will be setting up states to fail?
It will mean that a lot of our country will be in non-attainment areas for a long time, and for the areas where the forest products industry operates in the cleaner areas, the attainment areas, it's still going to be a major, major struggle for our projects, which, as we invest in our facilities to stay globally competitive, also result in reductions in cleaner air. So we're missing opportunities to reduce our emissions by thwarting these modernization projects. So it would definitely hurt.
Mr. Byrd, when areas are found to be in non-attainment, states are required to put together plans that provide a plausible strategy for achieving the emissions reductions, correct?
That is correct.
And if states are unable to submit a plausible plan, what happens? Would an EPA denial of a state plan lead to federal control, or would the transportation sanctions be levied? What would be the follow-up?
Those are the options under the Clean Air Act. EPA could create a federal implementation plan and also impose sanctions requiring the state to put forth more effort. Of course, it is a challenge where the strategies that are available to states are represent a very small portion of the inventory. As I mentioned in my initial testimony, many of the sources are outside of our regulatory control. International sources contribute to air pollution in Utah. Other state and natural sources contribute to air pollution in Utah, but the only authority that we have is to regulate the permitted sources, the manufacturing industries that we actually regulate in the state. So we have a very narrow ability to control the pollution, and it leads to that perpetual non-attainment.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Again, I thank all the witnesses for being here, and I yield.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes, for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to our witnesses today. As you know, we're discussing EPA's proposal to reduce the annual fine particulate matter National Ambient Air Quality Standards. That's a mouthful, so we use NAAQS to abbreviate it, which EPA has developed based on the best available science and technical information. As we talk about the implementation of these standards, it is important to understand that NAAQS are not prescriptive. So they don't impose specific requirements on businesses. Instead, NAAQS provide a general flexibility for states to choose how they will comply. And to help states make informed decisions when developing their implementation plans, EPA provides very important technical assistance and guidance, along with more than $200 million in grant funding annually to help the states reduce air pollution and meet these standards. Mr. Byrd, would you agree, speaking from your position, that adequate EPA funding and staffing are important and critical for your state's ability to effectively implement any national ambient air quality standards, whatever they may be?
I would probably extend that also to state funding. We would rely on grants through EPA to conduct the state program so that we can do analysis at the state level, monitoring at the state level, and that is an important part of the regulatory strategy that we have as a state.
Appreciate that. I mean, funding for that kind of assistance through grants, otherwise, is really important to make sure that standards can be adhered to across the country. Despite that, unfortunately, though, the Republicans are proposing to cut EPA's budget by nearly 40% for fiscal year 2024, which is shocking, really. It would diminish the resources that EPA can provide to states to help them implement NAAQS and other standards for that matter, and thus undermine states' ability to efficiently achieve healthy air for their residents. That's certainly moving in the wrong direction from a budget standpoint. Ms. Cooper, how important is it for EPA to have the resources necessary to assist states in implementing NAAQS, these fine particulate matter standards, especially when it comes to addressing the impacts of poor air quality on our most vulnerable populations?
Congressman, it's very important that EPA have the resources to provide technical assistance, as you mentioned, because although implementation of clean air is heavily emphasized at the local level, many states do not have the resources, the staff, to really address some of the technical issues, and they rely heavily upon EPA. So if EPA doesn't have an adequate budget to provide those resources, it's harming us at the local level as well.
I mean, I do also want to observe or register my disappointment that my Republican colleagues are objecting to following the science in this instance to protect the public through an updated, expert-informed fine particulate matter NAAQS. And I find it hard to square their arguments that a new standard would be too burdensome for states to implement with how they are simultaneously advocating for legislation that would cut the very resources states rely on to successfully implement the NAAQS standard. Doesn't really square with basic logic here. And the problem that they're speaking of is really a problem of their own making. I urge my colleagues to actually prioritize the health and well-being of all Americans, ensure EPA has the resources necessary to carry out its mission to do so. And I'll just make the other observation. Number one, I think that the public expects to be protected against air pollution by the EPA. Understands that's the critical role that EPA plays. The public would also concede that when standards come from the federal government, from the federal level, even ones that aren't particularly prescriptive but just set goals and then allow flexibility at the state level for those goals to be met, that it's reasonable to expect that resources will come behind those standards in order to assist states and localities in meeting them. That's a fair expectation. And that's an expectation that we've tried to meet and build into the budgets that we pass here. So if you're going to go cut an EPA budget by 40% with predictable consequences for the kind of technical assistance and guidance that your office can provide, that's really going against the expectation and will of the broad public in terms of the protections that it expects the EPA to provide. So I really hope my Republican colleagues in that larger context will be supportive of the resources you need to do your job. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and I want to thank our witnesses for your expertise in this important matter. Biden's EPA is prematurely proposing to revise the current fine particulate matter standards that will have disastrous effects on manufacturers, especially those in my state and in my district in Georgia. Furthermore, these heavy-handed top-down regulations often do not weigh the compliance and implementation, and oftentimes lies in the hands of states and the business community. Mr. Byrd, let's talk about the science for a moment here. Mr. Byrd, you noted in your testimony that states are co-regulators with the EPA in implementing the fine particular matter standards. Is that correct? Yes or no?
Yes.
Additionally, you mentioned the Clean Air Science Advisory Committee, CASAC or CSAC, I don't know, is required to have a voice from state regulators. But in the Biden EPA review, only one state regulator was on the panel, and that panelist's view were considered the minority view. Is that correct, sir?
That is correct, and
Okay.
overwhelmingly so. It was 1 versus 20.
Yeah. Considering that states are the ones tasked with implementing these standards and are responsible for compliance in these standards from the EPA, does it make sense that states' voices should be the minority view when it comes to assessing how to establish new standards or the science?
It does not.
What is the value of balanced views with people who actually have to implement standards and design compliance programs?
I think in the case of this standard, looking at, with an eye to implementation, understanding where the sources of the emissions are that are actually leading to the health impacts, if you can't tie the sources to a plan that you can develop to address that standard, that needs to be addressed in the standard setting process, and also understanding that the projected improvements can't be attained if there's not a path to get you to attainment.
Also, this is very one-sided. I understand that EPA has repeatedly failed to ensure the advisory panel examines the economic impacts of implementation, which is required in the law. Would that be of value to the states?
It absolutely would be, because that is, under this cooperative federalism, the burden is put on the states to then create a plan that works for them. And without that thoughtfulness in the standard setting process, it does put a burden on the states.
So this is very top-down minority, administration minority in the House requirement, basically, without input from other states or input from scientists who really know what they're doing in this area. Mr. Hunt, you demonstrated with your graphics that my state of Georgia is currently in compliance with the standards as they are set at the 12 micrograms per cubic meter. Now, again, the reason that we mentioned, and I hate that Texas, I guess when August asked, Mr. Pfluger asked his questions, he'd go concentrate on Texas. But let me tell you, Texas is growing and Georgia's growing. There's a reason for that, okay? Because these manufacturers have found a friend, and we have great leadership in our states, and they are complying with the standards as they currently exist. But if these standards are lowered, guess who it's going to hurt? The states that are growing the fastest. So tell me what's going on here. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources has data showing that the Augusta area, which is my district, would not be in compliance with these proposed standards. So what we're talking about today is going to affect the very people that I represent and their ability to provide for their families, their country, and their church and their communities. Is that a correct statement, Mr. Hunt?
Yes, no, we need achievable regulations that allow for those jobs to be created, those manufacturers to thrive, and to make the products that Americans demand. We make wood products that store carbon in the built environment. We do a lot of recycling of paper and making that into new products, and so we feel ourselves are a very sustainable industry, and we just hope that the regulations can also be sustainable.
And we have the cleanest air on the face of the earth. In fact, in my district of Georgia, we got welcome to the 12th district of Georgia. We got the cleanest air available anywhere in the world. Okay. Now there are some problems in this country. Maybe New York, maybe Atlanta, some areas like that. But don't penalize my district because of the problems with other cities. We need to, and that's the same thing with the climate change issue. It's the cities, these large, populous cities that are causing this data supposedly out there on climate change. So with that, my time is up and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
Let me thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Tonko, for holding this hearing today. I also want to thank our witnesses as well for being here to testify on the important rule which would update the long overdue NAAQS standard. It has been over a decade since this standard was strengthened. Since then, study after study has shown how fine particulate matter is much more harmful in the short term, as well as over time, than we had previously underscored or understood. Over 100 million Americans live in counties with unhealthy air pollution, and over 18 million people live in counties that receive failing grades for year-round particulate pollution. I agree with the point Ranking Member Pallone made earlier. The cost of not updating this standard in lives, in lost work days, in public health spending is unacceptable. I know many of my Republican colleagues like to speak about the cost this rule places on polluters, but we must recognize the cost of inaction. The EPA estimated that through updating this standard, the public health benefits of fewer hospitalizations, lives lost, could total as much as $43 billion over the next decade. So my first question is for Ms. Cooper. Ms. Cooper, I want to emphasize a point you made in your testimony. Black Americans 65 and older experience 3 times as many deaths attributed to exposure to this type of pollution compared to all other races. So when we consider the hundreds of thousands of deaths per year from poor air quality, we must recognize who is harmed the most by government's failure to act. Ms. Cooper, what would failing to update these standards mean for older Black Americans and communities of color?
Congresswoman Clark, failing to update the standards would mean that there would be more Black Americans, Black and brown Americans, people in low-wealth communities who would suffer the harms of particulate matter pollution and also, unfortunately, death.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper, what other groups are disproportionately harmed by particulate matter pollution, and how does this standard take vulnerable populations' exposure into account?
Congressman Clark, children are affected, pregnant women, unborn children are also affected, and again, there's research that shows the correlation between particulate pollution and these vulnerable classes of individuals.
Let me thank you for your response. It is incomprehensible to me that Republicans point to increased wildfire smoke, which is driven by climate change, but throw up their hands whenever we want to work together on concrete policies to reduce emissions and combat climate change. Almost every hearing this committee has held this year has been an attempt to gut the bedrock environmental laws and open up our lands to fossil fuel exploitation. Just last week, we voted on a bill that would reverse decades of progress made on cleaning up pollution from our transportation sector. Well, I remain committed to ensuring my constituents have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink, while also centering equity and protecting the most vulnerable among us. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, my fellow Ohioan. Thank you all for being here today, going into the afternoon now. My first question is for Mr. Hunt, Mr. Hammer, and Mr. Byrd. If the EPA withdraws the PM2.5 reconsideration, won't those standards be reviewed in about 2 years anyway, under the normal review cycle? Mr. Hunt, you can start and we'll get.
Yes, this rule is a discretionary reconsideration of a standard, so If EPA were to follow the normal 5-year review cycle, you would have to make a decision 2 years hence. So yes.
Mr. Hammer.
We would hope the EPA would do just that and take a more holistic, practical, balanced view.
Mr. Byrd.
Yes, that is my understanding as well.
Thank you very much. For the next three, again, do you believe there are any good, do you believe there are any concerns that need to be addressed this urgently? If so, what seems to be the rush from the EPA? Go ahead, Mr. Hunt.
We certainly feel that EPA's got the cart before the horse here as they lower these standards very close to background. We have been working with the agency and pointing out the gridlock that would happen if this standard was lowered. There's a lot of more scientific, more accurate modeling tools and inputs to these assessments that could change a lot of these pink areas back to green if EPA were to work with other stakeholders and vetted their plans to be able to get our air quality improving, but also providing an environment for business opportunities and growth.
Mr. Hammer.
It's far more urgent that we make the United States more competitive for manufacturing when we're engaged in a great power competition with China. And we do this country no favor, we do our people no favor when we move manufacturing out of the United States and have it go into a far more polluting country like China. You could take it to the bank. If you have a facility that's going up in China, there's a lot more emissions. There's a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. And that causes far more planetary harm than having it placed in the country with the cleanest water, the cleanest air on the planet, and that's the United States.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd.
Yeah, representing an environmental agency, of course, clean air is important to us. We've demonstrated that through our past planning efforts, being able to attain with the standard. And I think with my neighboring states that are represented here, with a very growing and vibrant economy as well. We're attracting businesses, we're growing, and our concern is not maybe challenging the health data or the impacts to that, but how you achieve the standard. And the fact that if you don't have a pathway or a plan to get there, perhaps some of the narrative, at least in my area, is perhaps inconsistent because the benefits will not be achieved unless you have a plan to get there.
Okay, thank you. My next question is for Mr. Hammer and for Mr. Hunt. In 2011, President Obama withdrew an EPA proposal to reconsider ozone standards, citing, in his words, the importance of reducing regulatory burdens and regulatory uncertainty, particularly as our economy continues to recover. Over the past 2 years, my constituents have dealt with record inflation, and rising energy costs. Mr. Hammer, Mr. Hunt, do you believe it is just as important now as it was in 2011 that we work to reduce regulatory burdens and uncertainty?
Yes, there is a lot of regulatory requirements that are facing the forest products industry. This is one of them. So it's very important to be careful as one contemplates additional requirements to make sure that the benefits outweigh the costs.
It's more important today, again, to sound like a broken record, given the great power competition with China. It's more important today to have sensible regulations.
Okay, with all due respect, you may not be able to answer this, but I do want to ask the question. If we have time, we'll do it. Mr. Hunt, in addition to non-attainable areas, EPA's proposed PM2.5 standards would significantly expand areas approaching non-attainment. You referenced this map earlier, which is above me, and it's here. You mentioned the pink area meets the standard but leaves insufficient room for projects to be permitted and move forward. Can you expand on how this is counterproductive to improving air quality? Wouldn't many of those projects actually lower emissions? I'm going to ask you to just submit those answers. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the Gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're discussing dangerous air pollution that is affecting over 100 million Americans. Specifically, we're talking about how to reduce fine particulate matter pollution that can affect the health of humans' hearts and lungs. It can increase the risk of heart attacks and amplify existing medical conditions like heart disease and asthma. And while I support efforts to strengthen the standards for fine particulate matter pollution, which could result in as many as 1,700 avoided premature deaths and 110,000 avoided lost workdays, I want to ask a few questions about the rule. But I first want to bring to attention of the subcommittee the largest source of particulate matter air pollution in the western United States, which is wildfire smoke. Poor land management and climate change are fueling extreme wildfires in California and across the West. And these fires endanger our communities, wildlife, and ecosystems, and are releasing dangerous smoke into the atmosphere, as many of us on the East Coast experienced earlier this year from the Canadian wildfires. Researchers in my district from the University of California, San Diego, and the Scripps Institution of Oceanography published research showing that particulate pollution from wildfire smoke is more harmful to human health compared to other pollution sources. Tens of millions of Americans are at risk of experiencing high levels of exposure to wildfire smoke, and vulnerable populations like infants, the elderly, and people with pre-existing health conditions like respiratory or cardiovascular disease are at higher risk of negative health effects from wildfire smoke. Extreme smoke events are already increasing emergency room visits, and more people will be at risk as wildfires continue to grow in frequency and intensity. Congress needs to act to reduce the severity of wildfires by both addressing the climate crisis and better managing our land. We also need a well-resourced, well-trained, and supported wildland firefighter force to reduce the severity of wildfires and help make our landscapes more fire resilient. Right now, Congress is failing to live up to its responsibility to support wildland firefighters that are putting their lives on the line to protect our communities and natural resources. And if we fail to act in the next 2 weeks, federal wildland firefighters could see their paychecks cut in half. The Federal Wildland Firefighters Union says that up to 50% of the wildland firefighter force could walk off the job unless Congress provides more resources. Now, we're not talking about wildfires in this committee, but we're talking about particulates. And it's one of those things about Congress is that the conversation we're really having is about particulate air pollution. A big part of that won't happen in this committee, but we need to be aware of it, and we need to help Congress act on it. I'm committing to work with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and partners in the Senate to find a resolution. Now back to this proposed rule. Ms. Cooper, can you speak to how the Clean Air Act and the National Ambient Air Quality Standards have reduced pollution in American communities without hurting the economy?
Congressman, what I can tell you is that when there are lost work days because of the health effects and impacts of particulate pollution, that affects the economy. And also, in terms of wildfires, they are a threat to air quality, and that's one of the reasons why at Moms Clean Air Force we believe that the EPA should take action against that type of pollution that they can control and that we can identify where there can be a contribution to cleaning the air because of these other problems that are also related to wildfires.
Thank you. As I said, I support this rule, Mr. Chairman, but if we don't act on wildfires, we will see the severity of particulate pollution increase exponentially, whatever we do in this committee, and I'll yield back.
Congressman, may I also add that even since the time that the Clean Air Act was enacted, our quality of air has improved, and also GDP has quadrupled, so I believe we can say that we can have both.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for holding this hearing. You know, it's amazing to me how these debates all turn into some kind of climate emergency, and we start quoting things that are becoming more and more apparent, even from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that climate change is not the cause of the wildfires. The interesting thing about this, Mr. Chairman, to me, is that nearly 25% of the particulate matter in the air over Los Angeles on any given day originated in China. And I just wonder how the EPA plans to regulate particulate matter from China. I don't think there's an answer for that, and I just wonder, Mr. Hunt, is it fair to impose these standards on the states and local governments when, in fact, we've reduced fine particulate matter emissions by 41%, even though our GDP's up over 270%. Is it fair to impose these standards on state and local governments when it doesn't even originate in the United States, much less in their states?
Congressman, it's not fair. Pollution's complicated, comes from many different sources. As has been noted, we have some of the best air quality in the world, and we compete against areas like Southeast Asia and China that have air quality that's 6 times worse than ours.
Well, it's also reported that Asian air pollution contributed as much as 65% of the ozone increase in the western United States, which out there they call it smog, even though there's been a 50% reduction in U.S. emissions that cause smog. So we're going in the right direction, but it seems punitive to me, especially given how this is going to impact the forest industry, how it's going to impact cement, how it's going to impact steel production, because about 35% of China's pollution comes from their industries. They produce, I think, 51% of the cement and 55% of the world's steel. So it's interesting to consider that we're paying for the products that we get from China by breathing the pollution that they send across the Pacific. Again, I wish someone from the EPA was here, Mr. Chairman, to answer how they plan to regulate the particulate matter that's originating in China that's coming over here that they want to impose on us to further damage our economy, to reduce the number of jobs, when we're already doing a really good job at this. But yet, it seems like it's a political agenda to me to blame everything on climate change and to further do harm to our communities this way. You want to comment on that, Mr. Hunt?
Thank you. No, it certainly penalizes us. The maps behind you are based on what is the background air quality in the United States. And so even though the average is 8 micrograms, some of it, as you've noted, comes from overseas, whether that's China, from Mexico or Canada. But that penalizes us because that takes up some of the headroom, some of the opportunity for growth and new projects from our great industry in America. So we're less able to compete because the way our system works in terms of how we permit projects has to take into account that background emissions that is very challenging to control, even though we've made substantial reductions in our emissions over the decades and continue to do so regardless of whether this rule is finalized or not.
Well, we just saw a report where a leading climate scientist admitted that he manipulated his findings in order to be published. I think it's in specific, I think it was one of Nature or one of these magazines, that he admitted that he exaggerated things in order to get published, because if he said what was really true about the cause of wildfires, he would never get published. It doesn't fit the narrative. And it seems that we're doing the same thing on some of these, and we're doing harm to people with these policies. And it's amazing to me, 29% of the pollution above San Francisco on any given day originated in China. We got to figure out a way to deal with that, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now the chair recognizes my friend and colleague from California, Dr. Ruiz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pollution is real. Climate change is real. We're starting to see extremes in weather. In fact, I live in the desert in the Coachella Valley, and all of you probably saw in the news the tropical storm Hillary. I can tell you, I live in the desert. We haven't seen a tropical storm in the desert. And you're starting to see more and more of these kind of phenomena. And pollution is a deadly threat to public health. Hundreds of studies and peer-reviewed literature have found that these microscopic particles, the PM2.5, can reach the deepest regions of the lungs. In fact, it goes beyond the lungs. It goes through the lung-blood barrier and straight into the bloodstream. Exposure to fine particles is associated with asthma exacerbation, asthma deaths, chronic bronchitis, decreased lung function, respiratory diseases, and even premature death. I've seen them in the emergency department treating patients. I've seen them firsthand, the dangerous impacts of these fine particle levels. So this deadly pollution disproportionately affects the most vulnerable amongst us. Like, don't get me wrong, it affects everybody, but it disproportionately affects the most vulnerable amongst us, the children, seniors, those with chronic lung and heart diseases, and those with low-income populations that don't have the resources to protect themselves. In the western part of my district, the San Jacinto Valley has seen an increase of warehouse development, for example, especially along the I-10 freeway. These increases in development have brought on an influx of trucking traffic, causing more car exhaust, an example of a fine particle pollutant to run through the streets and the neighborhoods. And this is happening in cities across my district, like Banning, Beaumont, and Hemet. In fact, I just spoke with some constituents about the haze of dust and pollution over the Coachella Valley as well. With the winds and the tropical storm Hillary, it's kind of laying over there, and we have hazardous air quality in my district. In fact, Riverside County is one of the worst air qualities in the country. The American Lung Association has graded the county in an F grade for annual particle pollution. However, Congress has made some common sense investments to help communities across the country reduce transportation-related pollution, including harmful particulate matter, through funding for the Diesel Emissions Reduction Act program, also known as the DERA. So the DERA provides federal funding for states and territories to replace dirty, polluting diesel engines with cleaner, more efficient technologies. Nothing wrong with that. My home state of California regularly takes advantage of this opportunity, as do many others across the country. So, Mr. Byrd, it appears that your state received over $2 million in DERA funding in 2021. Are programs like DERA an important tool for states as they work to reduce pollution in communities?
They are, and that's, of course, part of a comprehensive plan that states and EPA and Congress have put into place to reduce the burden of air pollution across the country that has been so effective.
Thank you. And Ms. Cooper, as states implement air pollution standards, how important is it that communities have access to resources in order to reduce pollution in their area, especially in communities that are disproportionately affected by pollution?
It's very important. Unfortunately, because of historical patterns of residential problems and systematic racism that has resulted in many Black and brown and low-wealth individuals being in communities that are closer to highways, closer to polluting plants. All of these things impact the quality of air more on these communities than others, although, as has been stated, everyone is affected.
Thank you. You know, as we approach this, we need to put people over politics and really put the health of individuals first and foremost. I'm a public health expert. I put my blinders on. I work with anybody in a bipartisan way to make sure that the end result is better health for individuals. And this is something that's very clear, that the studies in the medical and the public health literature have a direct link between air quality and quantity of life. And we have seen some studies that show a decrease on average by 10 years of individuals who live in poor air quality areas. And so here we are addressing an EPA study that will help improve that even more. So these are rules that have real life impact. Now, how many of us want to live long enough to see our grandchildren graduate from high school? How many of us want to see our children get married and have a great life and start their career? I do. So if we all want to have better lives, and we all need to start working and have common sense and put people above institutions. And no matter how hard it is to address this issue. No matter how hard it is for states to come to compliance, the government needs to work for the people, be in compliant for the health of the people so that people can have better lives. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you,
for
Mr.
5
Chairman.
minutes.
And for the record, in your opening statement, you made a comment that by putting more pressure on these standards, it would drive more and more business away and hurt us economically. And I want to just say, I think you're absolutely right. And for a note here, we've been doing a little bit of homework. Our friends in China have stated that they hope that by the year 2035, in their population centers, they can get to the same level of objectives, which is the 35 level, that we put in place in 2006. And so somewhere around 30 years behind us is where they are. So I think your statement is absolutely correct. When we drive more and more business there, we just put more and more negative output on the planetary scale. And so, Mr. Byrd, Mr. Hunt, I've got comments from both of you on this. Some of us are going down similar roads here, but Mr. Byrd, I'll start with you. In a September 7 letter to EPA Administrator Reagan, members of the committee noted that wildfires and unpaved roads contribute up to 84% of particulates and gaseous particulate matter precursors going into the air. Meanwhile, only 16% of such particulates come from industrial sources and power plants. So given that layout, will imposing more stringent air quality standards on that 16% of the alleged sources, is that going to help our overall situation, or is that going to hurt it?
So I think based in the context of we've been doing this for many, many years, of course, the controls are already in place on a number of those controllable sources. And what we're left with now is these more remote sources, forest fires. Utah's the second driest state in the nation, neighbor of yours. Of course, that is a concern for us as well, is the dust from the West Desert that impacts the Wasatch Front is more of a factor than the local sources that we can regulate.
So can I understand from that imposing more stringent air quality standards on that 16% is not going to help our overall situation?
Yes, that is what we believe, that we've already put the controls that are reasonable. Additional controls will have an added burden, but not have the corresponding.
Mr. Hunt, can you comment on that, please?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, as I stated earlier, we already have substantial pollution control equipment on our facilities. We've reduced our nitrogen oxide emissions by 50% and our sulfur dioxide emissions by over 80%. We're less than 1% of the overall PM emissions. So focusing on the same sources again and again, you're squeezing the rock. There's not any additional reductions that can be achieved. And by creating this permitting gridlock, by lowering the standard without a good implementation plan, could even jeopardize opportunities for my mills to modernize and install more efficient equipment that by definition will mean less emissions per ton of product, and that product would be made in America.
Okay, you actually answered the second question I had for you as well, so thank you for that. Mr. Byrd, very quickly, several commenters on EPA's proposed rule suggest that the EPA has authority under the Clean Air Act to classify and exempt prescribed burns as an exceptional event. However, Section 319 of the statute states that to qualify for an exceptional event, any event must not be reasonably controlled or preventable, and if it is a human activity, not recurring. So given that context, would you worry that if there was a lawsuit, the EPA might have some problems and exceptional event determinations for prescribed burns?
That is a concern for us, and under the regional haze planning requirements, it looks like that's the way things are going.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, with that, I'd like to yield the rest of my time to the gentleman from Alabama.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from, oh, you yield back. Okay, Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, I just want to point out that Hurricane Hillary was not the first hurricane to make landfall in California. There were 8 since 1850. The last one was 1939. It killed 100 people. Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlemen.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Folger.
Thank you.
Luger,
That's okay.
for 5 minutes.
I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman. I represent the Permian Basin, and this area is the largest and most important and most productive area for oil and gas and energy, quite frankly, in the United States. We're constantly facing different threats. The threat of the day right now is the threat of a non-attainment redesignation, and really the economic impact of this would be in the billions. But it's not just the economic impact, it's actually more the impact to citizens in this country, the 330 million people who depend on affordable and reliable energy production. And despite the administration's best efforts to kill the oil and gas industry, it still remains strong, and whether it's petrochemicals, whether it's plastics, whether it's going into an emergency room and seeing the PPE gear, it depends on feedstock that comes from a cleaner and more efficient area, and that's the area that I represent. Mr. Hamer, you referenced in your testimony the Oxford Economics study on the cost of the EPA's newly proposed fine particulate matter standard. I know you've talked about this here today, and found that they could affect us to the tune of 160, maybe even close to $200 billion in outputs. When you look at the costs that are in addition to the hundreds of billions of dollars in potential industry cost of the newly proposed standards, do you think these estimates sound reasonable?
I do, Congressman. These estimates, unfortunately, are reasonable, and it would cost the Texas economy billions of dollars and thousands of jobs. And I just appreciate your great leadership. The Permian Basin is keeping this country going economically, and is also helping our allies abroad through a very difficult period of time.
Well, let me thank you for that. Do you believe the Biden administration's proposal for lowering the standard recognizes and balances these economic risk with, the other ball that's in the air, which is climate affordability?
It's absolutely not balanced, and we heard earlier today how unbalanced it is. And Congressman, we would like to see a holistic approach that balances out these different issues. 84% of the remaining PM2.5 is from wildfires, road dust, and other non-point sources.
Does it leave enough headroom for businesses and attainment areas to obtain the permits they need to grow? I mean, and we're now we're not even talking about the energy industry. We're talking about any manufacturing, any building, anything that we do in this country.
That's exactly right. This rule would have a very broad negative effect on the competitiveness of the American economy.
Yeah, the facts, despite not actually looking at the facts, we're actually hurting ourselves in the national security of this country. Speaking of wildfires, Mr. Byrd, if wildfires increase because of limitation of the prescribed burns, which we do in my area, manufacturing being driven to countries with less stringent environmental standards, the exporting of CO2 to places like China, and the other impacts we've talked about, is it possible that these standards could actually have an adverse effect on our air quality despite in name being something else?
Yes, Congressman. As we've looked at the air pollution that impacts our state, of course, international transport is part of that. There are provisions in the Clean Air Act that are available to let states address that in the planning process, but those have not been either allowed or approved by EPA in the past. And so that is a concern for us. We're seeing a greater contribution and a greater relative contribution to local emissions, even from international emissions as far as China.
I'm glad you brought that up. One of the most bipartisan issues on this committee is China. So let's talk about, Mr. Hamer, the competition with China, and if we go to this new proposed rule, what that does, and I've got one more question after this, what does it do with our competition to China?
Well, I will say the Communist Chinese Party would be very happy because it will simply make them more competitive. It means for semiconductors, for energy, for advanced auto manufacturing, all of those different areas will make China a more attractive place to do business, and that's obviously very negative.
When you look at the Clean Air Act and the toxins like nitrous oxide and some of the others. I personally don't see CO2 as a toxin. In fact, when you look at the life expectancy, it's increased as a result of places that have clean energy. So, Mr. Byrd, can you give us your opinion on CO2 as a toxin?
Yeah, it's not a toxin, but is currently regulated under the EPA regulations.
Mr. Chairman, my time has expired. Yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses on what's a very important topic. Mr. Byrd, in your testimony, I was astonished when I heard you say that when wildfires are burning in Utah, the particulate emissions from those wildfires are between 10 and 100 times the amount of all of the other regulated sources put together. And I know other people here on the panel have testified that wildfires are the single largest causes of particulate emissions in the United States. So it would seem to me that a more realistic strategy for solving this problem with particulates would be to do a better job at managing our forests, at doing fuels reduction, and reducing the frequency and severity of these wildfires. Would you agree with that?
I would, and that was the reason I included it there. Of course, states don't have the ability to do that, but it is including the data that was used to set the health standards. And so there's this disconnect that the largest source of emissions that's impacting public health is not able to be regulated under the context of the Clean Air Act. And of course, what the East Coast saw this summer with the wildfire influences from Canada, in Utah and California, we call that summertime. That's every summer for us.
Right. Well, I mean, the point is we should be having, taking a whole of government approach to solving this problem, because everyone agrees that we want to prioritize the health of our communities and our children. If this is the single largest source of those particulates, my goodness, let's make a government commitment to reduce it. And we can do that, perhaps not under the Clean Air Act, but we can certainly recommit to managing at least BLM and national forest lands, which, you know, honestly, as a representative from Western State, I can tell you we do a terrible job at right now. Mr. Hunt, I'd like to bring up something specifically that California has been struggling with. So a few months ago, the EPA proposed to disapprove of California's 2012 SIP for the San Joaquin Valley. And what they said, I thought was really eye-opening. They said that they wanted to disapprove it because it was unrealistic and didn't produce a plausible strategy for achieving attainment. And the reason why this resonated with me is that as someone from California, I can tell you that the agencies involved here are in complete lockstep with the administration in their prioritization of solving this problem. You know, they probably don't disagree with what the EPA is trying to do. So it's not that they don't want to achieve attainment, it's that there is no plausible strategy for achieving attainment. And this new proposed EPA regulation would make that situation even worse. Can you talk a little bit about the impact on states like California that non-attainment would occur? And I'm talking about things like loss of highway funds. You know, not minor things, not a slap on the wrist. To tell everyone in the San Joaquin Valley, no more federal funds for building roads for you because you failed to attain something that even your state agency says is unattainable. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm not that familiar with the San Juan example, but I think it is illustrative of the fact that, you know, our air quality challenges are much more complex than they've ever been. We've got, you know, cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels. You know, we've heard about the diesel bus replacement program. Those are all making substantial strides, yet we still can't get ourselves into attainment, and that's a challenge. And so looking at a wider spectrum of emissions, obviously needing to manage our federal lands to avoid those wildfires is a huge importance. Obviously, as the forest products industry, we rely on the forest for our products. So we're making sustainable products, you know, that sequester carbon in the built environment, and we're so excited about being able to expand those opportunities. But yes, those impacts of penalties on highway funds are quite real when you get into these severe non-attainment situations.
Right. Well, I mean, it certainly would have a severe impact on the people that I represent. Ms. Cooper, I had one question for you. I want to thank you for being here. I know it's not easy to be the opposition witness, and your perspective is really valuable, which is why we try and balance the panel. You said something in your testimony that I thought was really important. You said that nothing is more important than the health of our families and our communities. And I think that probably everyone here on the dais would agree with you, regardless of political party, regardless of what committees or subcommittees we serve on. I think everyone would agree. The problem is, how do we prioritize that? Because health has so many different aspects, and some of the consequences of what the EPA is trying to do would have a negative impact on other aspects of health, like nutrition, for example, if you don't have food adequacy. So how do we balance as a society these competing demands?
With respect to the Clean Air Act, the focus is on public health. And within the jurisdiction, at least as I understand it, of the EPA, they regulate that part of clean air that is based on science and how to reduce the pollutants that have been identified as the most critical ones. We have to always take a holistic view of trying to do the best that we can, but in order to be able to consider these other aspects of health, we absolutely have to be able to breathe. So you have to start somewhere, and I believe that one of the best places to start is to start with the impacts on those variety of important health conditions that I've mentioned about cardiovascular disease, pregnancy, birth outcomes, asthma, about protecting children and the elderly.
Oh, thank you. I know my time has expired. I cheated by turning it over to you right as my time was up. But thank you very much for your perspective and for everyone on the panel. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Badagon, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, and thank you, Ms. Cooper, for all your work with Mom's Clean Air Force, and to our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Cooper, I want to direct my questions to you. You just said something that sounded like common sense, and that was the basic notion is health is you got to be alive, you got to breathe. And so I represent a district that's in South Los Angeles at the port. It's surrounded by the port, a lot of refineries, a lot of freeways, where air pollution is a huge issue. So much so that children have inhalers around their necks, and the doctor's offices stock up on the asthma inhalers. And there's nothing more heartbreaking than when you have children who cannot breathe, and you would do anything to help them breathe. So your advocacy and the work that you do helps to make sure that we are, as lawmakers, doing everything we can to make sure our communities have access to clean air and can breathe. Ms. Cooper, my first question is that the EPA's proposed rule to strengthen our national standard for particulate matter would provide $17 to $43 billion in public health benefits through 2032. Can you describe and expand really on what those numbers mean for everyday people and what public health benefits we can expect from a stronger standard?
Congresswoman, as I mentioned in my testimony, Mom's Clean Air Force hears from families all across the country. We have members in every state. We do know, and I know through my work as being the national manager from Health Equity, that communities that have Black and brown communities, communities of low wealth, who are already in neighborhoods that are closer to highways, closer to polluting plants, so they're starting from a compromised position in terms of the quality of air that they breathe. And what we are hoping for is that the EPA will adopt a standard that protects these communities especially, but all communities, that protects their health.
And can you expound on why Mom's Clean Air Force has called for the EPA's final rule to be stronger?
Well, we have called for the rule to be the strongest as possible because that's what the independent scientific committees have recommended. And because if the stronger standard is adopted, it will also literally save the lives of more people.
Well, thank you, and I agree with you, and I think a lot of my colleagues, I I know on this side of the aisle do. In March, 85 members of Congress, led by myself, Representative Blunt Rochester, and Senator Markey, wrote to EPA in support of a final rule that follows the recommendation of the agency's Scientific Advisory Committee. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record, that letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper, Eco Madres is a group within Clean Air, the Moms Clean Air Force, made up of parents and caregivers that work to protect Latino families from air pollution and climate change. They've advocated for a strong particulate matter rule. Can you describe, and I know you've just talked a little bit about it, can you describe why less particulate matter pollution would particularly benefit Latino and communities of color?
Congresswoman, as I was just mentioning, because of the positioning of neighborhoods, particularly many Latino neighborhoods close to polluting sources, that exacerbates the impact of poor air quality on those communities, particularly where people basically live, learn, and play. There are many schools that cannot sometimes have outdoor activities because of poor air quality. And again, this is often related to particulate matter or particulate pollution.
Right. Well, thank you. You know, 68% of Latinos in the United States live in areas that do not meet the federal air quality standard, and we believe a stronger particulate matter rule can help address that disparity. Mr. Chair, I'd also like to enter into the record this article from the Washington Post of April 28th, entitled Deadly Air Pollutant Disproportionately and Systematically Harms Americans of Color, Study Finds.
Without objection, so ordered. And then gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes gentlelady from Iowa, Dr. Miller-Meeks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When I think about the EPA's Particulate Matter 2.5 reconsideration proposal, I have immediate concerns about the impact of the proposed rule on economic development in my district and in my state, especially in communities reliant on farming and steel production. EPA's Particulate Matter 2.5 reconsideration proposal threatens to adjust already rigorous standards for Particulate Matter 2.5 to levels even more difficult to attain. Mr. Byrd, can you speak to the air quality improvements that have occurred in recent years, or have there been none?
No, there have been dramatic improvements. Of course, the Clean Air Act has been very effective. States have created plans that found reasonable controls that were able to be put into place. The challenge now moving forward is they become more costly and more impactful as we go to lower and lower standards. And of course, can we achieve the standards? Perhaps some of the benefits that have been mentioned are not achievable if we end up in perpetual non-attainment versus actually improving air quality.
And how should EPA consider these improvements in air quality as it contemplates a de facto environmental tax on domestic industry?
Certainly, the progress is being made. If you look at the trend charts that I provided in my written testimony, you can see that we've made great improvements, and we're going to continue to make improvements. There's a implementation of the law, which is one part of what we do, but we are a public health agency, and we are protecting public health and driving cleaner technologies, incentivizing cleaner technologies. That will continue whether or not this standard is changed.
You know, speaking of cleaner technologies and new technologies, I'm particularly interested in the potential impact of the PM2.5 proposal on the American steel industry, which leads the world in clean steel production, 40% cleaner than other countries. I'm proud that Iowa's 1st District is home to SSAB, Montpelier Plant, and their Gerdau Wilton Mill. The industry expressed its substantial concern with the EPA's proposal, stating that the new standard could cost the iron and steel sector between $3.1 billion and $9.3 billion in total compliance costs. Mr. Byrd and Mr. Hamer, do you agree that the compliance cost of rules like these make domestic industries like the steel sector less competitive internationally, and that doing so allows more steel products made overseas, often with much larger environmental footprint, to be imported to the U.S.?
Yeah, certainly the technology that really has led the world in modernizing manufacturing with as few emissions as possible. Certainly, as borne out with better products. We certainly don't see that in other areas of the country without those same standards.
I agree 100% with your comments, Congresswoman, as well as Mr. Bird's.
And when steel is imported from overseas under less environmental safe conditions, does that air stay in China or India, for example?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. And in fact, SSAB in my district now has a zero-emission steel that has been produced. Another concern I've heard from multiple industries in my district is that the proposal would make the expansion of existing facilities or the siting of new facilities more difficult. Mr. Hunt, would this impact the expansion of existing facilities or the siting of new facilities in your industries?
Yes, very much so. We've looked at a number of projects that just recently got permitted under the 12 microgram standard, and the vast majority of those would not be able to proceed. That represents tens of billions of dollars of investment and thousands of jobs. So we're very concerned that we would be offshoring our manufacturing and offshoring those jobs.
Mr. Hamer, Mr. Byrd, the rule we're discussing today is not the only EPA regulation that states and businesses have to deal with. And there's a cumulative impact for all of this regulatory activity. And also, let me say that if we're not competitive globally and we hurt the economy in the United States and we have decreasing tax revenues because we can't grow our economy and employ people, that in fact hurts our ability to do public health, to do healthcare, to invest in a cleaner environment. Does it not? So, and are these cumulative impacts a problem for your industries?
It's a huge issue. It's probably one of the greatest threats to the American economy.
Yeah, EPA's current regulatory agenda is robust. I think there's over 70 actions that are either in progress, under consideration, or in final rulemaking right now. That is a challenge for us as state regulators, just to keep track of all that's going on, and of course communicating that to our industry, our citizens, to make sure that those can be addressed in time.
Yeah. As a doctor, I know all about robust regulatory agencies. So with that, thank you so much to our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Pence, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Tonko, for letting me wave on to this. Command and control regulations in EPA's PM 2.5 rule are bad for Hoosiers and Americans. This regulation will raise costs on Hoosier businesses and hinder economic growth in the state. Why do I say that, what I know about it? In 2004, a man named Mitch Daniels became the governor of Indiana, and he put me on his transition team to take over the Indiana Department of Environmental Management and fight the EPA and the Indiana Department of Environmental Management, which was the biggest impediment to growth in the state. And we solved that problem by getting industry and IDEM and the EPA to work together. Mr. Hunt, as you said, at a time when companies are looking to reshore domestic manufacturing, this rule serves as a detriment to new investment. Instead of working alongside states to advance common goals of improving air quality, this rule was hastily thrown together, built off faulty data and unsubstantiated projections. Across Indiana's 6 districts, stakeholders and state officials have voiced their opposition to this rule. State officials found several inaccuracies in the proposed rules, data sets, and complete misrepresentations of existing facilities across the state. As a result, cost estimates are built off these assumptions are untenable, and the technology requirements are not feasible. The magnitude of emission control requirements and permitting timelines needed to comply with this rule extend far beyond what is reasonable. Last week, I sponsored a roundtable with Hoosier stakeholders in Indiana, in Indianapolis, who are working together in earnest to implement features of the electrification policy, which would help reduce particulates. Utilities, research universities such as Purdue University, Vincennes University, parking and mobility experts, and EV charging station developers joined together in the 6th District to share lessons learned and best practice as part of this transition. A common theme amongst the group was that the timelines and excessive regulations are far ahead of what is possible. Mr. Hammer, state officials and stakeholders have repeatedly told me that EPA's ambitious timelines for implementing their regulations are not practical, realistic, or affordable. How do you view the timelines of implementation of the PM 2.5 rule from the industry's perspective? What are you hearing?
It's not practical. It's not practical, and it doesn't identify the fact that 84% of the PM 2.5 is from wildfires. And Congressman, this is universal across chambers. This is National Association of Manufacturers. I was just with Kevin Brinegar, my colleague who runs the Indiana Chamber.
Right, retiring.
And he's retiring. All of the major state chambers across the country oppose this. We support clean air. What we oppose are regulations that simply are not practicable and will cost lots of jobs.
Yeah, let's get it done, but let's do it right, and let's just not ruin the economic prosperity and the health that we can provide our citizens. With that, I'd like to yield my time to Congressman Pfluger.
Thank you to my colleague. Mr. Hammer, as far as the non-attainment discussion going on in the Permian Basin, first off, would it surprise you to know that there's only 2 sensors, air quality sensors in the Permian Basin that are leading in this particular discussion? And by the way, they're located in New Mexico. Not a single sensor is located in Texas. So interested to hear the two of y'all's thoughts on the state implementation plan and whether or not this is just a targeted assault on the fossil fuel industry.
Well, it certainly is a pattern. What's going on, as you know, Congressman, in the Permian Basin fuels the United States of America. And you think in an inflationary environment, thank God for the Permian Basin, thank God for the technology that allows all Americans access to the cleanest fuel produced on the planet.
Mr. Byrd, any thoughts?
No, I can't speak to the monitoring decisions, but of course, it is a challenge. When we look at the impacts of air pollution, we look at the potential benefits, those are always weighed, and as a state agency, we're always balancing that impact versus benefit.
The benefit, I think, is when you look at the science of life expectancy and you see access to energy, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, where some of the life expectancy ages are 55, 56, 57 years old, has increased to 75, 80 in places that have access to clean energy. That's the impact. Go ahead.
That's the impact, and it's also good for one's health to have a job.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better, and thank God for the Permian Basin. I yield back to my friend from Indiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Seeing no further members here to ask questions, I want to thank our panelists for being here today, and I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. Without objection, that will be the order. I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you all.